Hello, and welcome back to PBH-435, Health Studies of Dangerous Drugs. Today we're going to be talking about drug policy, or our attempts to regulate and control drug use and manufacturing here in the United States. Throughout our lecture today, we're going to be talking about two different classes of drug laws. All the laws that we'll discuss break down into one of these categories. The first category is the regulation of legal drugs. These are laws that apply to people who manufacture prescription drugs, those who dispense them, and the physicians who prescribe them. So these are all drugs that are legal to manufacture and consume here in the United States. Our other category are those illicit drugs, the drugs that are now associated with criminal behavior, and these laws in this category regulate or outlaw the use, possession, and sales of these sorts of drugs. Now, when we look at where these regulations started, it's important to realize that at the beginning of the 1800s or the 19th century here in the United States, there was virtually no legislation regarding the use of any type of drug here in the United States. No age requirements, no manufacturing standards, no laws for prescriptions, none of it. Basically, if you wanted to put together a medication, cook it up in your backyard, call it an elixir or a tonic, and tell people that it would cure their headaches or restore their hair or basically anything that you wanted, there were no laws or restrictions against you doing that. Now, if you prepared that medication and sold it, and it ended up being dangerous or hazardous to people's health, there are really no restrictions against that either. So you might lose customers and you might have people who are angry with you, but it was not illegal because there were no laws governing that type of drug manufacturing. So as we look at where this legislation started, there are two really important roots for why we started making these laws. And the first one is that kind of fraud that we just talked about, those patent medicines, the elixirs and tonics that people would create and sell that wouldn't do what they said they were going to do, or would end up being dangerous in and of themselves. And then our second category has to do with morality and race. And this is typically where we start talking about drugs that we now categorize as drugs of abuse. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we dig into particular drugs and laws. We're going to be looking at three major pieces of legislation that still affect how we handle our drug regulation here in the United States in the 21st century. The first one is the Pure Food and Drugs Act, which was passed in 1906, the 1914 Harrison Act, and then we'll also spend some time talking about the 18th Amendment, which of course started the period we know as Prohibition, during which the manufacturing, transportation, sale, and use of alcohol was illegal here in the United States. So we're talking about how we started legislating here in the United States. You can see the image here on the screen was for toothache drops, apparently appropriate for children, that contain cocaine. And this was legal for sale. They were manufactured. They probably did a really good job handling that pain. And of course, it's something that we now think about as inappropriate and very, very dangerous. But at the time, you could find this in your local drugstore. So this is one of the issues that people were concerned about when we talk about those patent medicines, those drugs that were created and sold without any regulation, is these would be habit forming. Consuming cocaine in this form could be just as dependence inducing as some of the other methods of consuming cocaine. So that was definitely a problem. And then of course those false therapeutic claims, that concoction you cooked up in your backyard probably didn't actually help with people's headaches. So those two types of fraud, false therapeutic claims and then content that was actually habit forming, were two things that caused a lot of public uproar at the time that these laws started to be created. So one of the first drugs that became illicit here in the United States, one of the first drug laws that we see passed against drug use, many of these laws had to do with the use of opium. If we think back to historical trends at the time, there was a large influx of Chinese immigrants to the United States around this time period. And opium smoking was a cultural habit that came along with them. Now this was not something that was considered illegal at the time in the United States, but we'll see this trend that we'll repeat several times as we talk about different illicit drugs here in the U.S., where cultural concerns about the presence of the immigrants was translated into the legislating against the use of a substance that was thought to be common among that population. So we see laws passed against importing, manufacturing, and using opium. And really what we're looking at is the legal representation of a cultural concern. We couldn't outlaw being Chinese or being an immigrant, but we could outlaw this behavior that was strongly associated with Chinese immigrants at the time. And again, we'll see this pattern repeat as we talk about several of our illicit drugs throughout this class. The next one that we saw a cultural trend towards outlawing was cocaine. Now again, this was present in pharmaceutical products. It was a common thing at the time, and probably, again, highly effective. So we saw it present in patent medicines, and then also in substances that were consumed for widely throughout the culture. This is coca wine. So this was a beverage that contained some concentration of cocaine in it. And the urban legend is true. Coca-Cola, in its original formulation, also had a trace of cocaine in it as well. So this was, again, something that was widely available. There was not a real strong cultural prejudice against it, but at a certain time in our history, it became associated with use by African Americans. There were news stories, very sensational and not all true, about crimes that were committed by African Americans who were consuming cocaine at the time. So if you think back again to race relations here in the United States in the 1800s, we couldn't outlaw being African American. We'd taken care of that one during the Civil War. We couldn't outlaw the actual presence of the people in society, so what we ended up outlawing was a behavior that was associated with this population. So we see laws against the use and manufacturing of cocaine starting to become prevalent during this time period. And if you just take a quick look at the fine print of that advertising there, if you had a professional card and you were a doctor or a clergyman at the time, then you could get a free sample bottle of the coca wine. So again, no real strong cultural prejudice against the substance itself, and really only started to become outlawed when it became associated with this population that faced racism and prejudice in our society. Okay, so that's our summary of some of our early attempts to make certain drugs illicit here in the United States through legal action. When we look at legal action on the federal level, one of the first bills that we see is the Pure Food and Drug Acts of 1906. So this was actually about those patent medicines that we discussed. And the goal of the legislation was to make sure that anything that was sold as a drug was pure, it didn't contain any contaminants that were dangerous to health, and they were honestly labeled. If it said that it was going to relieve your headache, you had some confidence that that's what it would actually do. And the jurisdiction for this type of enforcement was through the Department of Agriculture. Now, one of the first efforts we see at the federal level, we saw those laws for against opium use and cocaine use start at the local level, work their way up to the state level, and then finally at the federal level in 1914 we see the Harrison Act. So the first effort of the federal government is not to make the drugs illegal, but it's actually to get a piece of the pie. So the Harrison Act actually affected behavior by the Treasury Department, and its purpose was to start taxing drugs like opium and cocaine, and to limit the people who could prescribe them and manufacture them to people who would then pay taxes on them. So their goal there is to tax those drugs and to restrict commerce in opioids and cocaine to folks who were authorized rather, and then also taxed for their participation in that industry. So that's the Harrison Act, our first federal effort. And note again, it does not make the drug use illegal, it just starts to tax the behavior. So a little bit more about the Pure Food and Drug Acts. The purpose here is, again, because it's federal government and has limited powers, so its first effort is to prohibit interstate commerce. Interstate commerce is one of the powers that's reserved to the federal government, regulation of interstate commerce in the Constitution. So if you were going to create one of those backyard elixirs or tonics, and it was either adulterated, it had contaminants in it, or you were saying that it did things that it didn't do, then you couldn't take that across state lines to sell it. Now, the misbranding, saying that it did things that it didn't, this really only applies to the labeling, not yet to advertising. At this point in the history of our country, we're not really regulating advertising at all. So you could say out loud that your cocoa wine did lots and lots of things, but on the label, you could only say things that you knew were true, okay? And as we move through the 20th century, we'll see amendments because we still basically work with, we still consume drugs that are regulated by this act. We'll see amendments that apply to whether or not the medication is safe and whether or not it is also effective, okay? So this is the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act. So the Harrison Act, again, this is a piece of tax legislation. So its goal is to require those who produce, import, manufacture, compound, deal in, dispense, or give away these drugs to register and pay taxes. The first two substances that were included were opium and cocaine, and then it was expanded to include other controlled substances, which we'll continue to talk about throughout class. So when we talk about the regulation of pharmaceuticals, now we're talking about prescription drugs, those drugs that are prescribed by physicians and legal to take. One of the important concepts that we'll talk about here is purity. Now, again, because you could cook up that elixir or tonic in your backyard and you could put in really anything you wanted, one of the things that we were looking to control was the purity of that substance. So according to the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, you have to accurately list the contents. So if you're going to put, horse manure or tar in your medication, then it needs to show up on the label. Initially, like a lot of regulatory efforts here in the United States, manufacturers were supposed to cooperate voluntarily. But in 1912, we actually saw an amendment to the Pure Food and Drug Act that made cooperation mandatory. So if you made false or fraudulent claims, then you could be prosecuted under the Shirley Amendment to the Pure Food and Drug Act. So another major social goal at the time was the safety of these medications, but we don't actually see that included in the 1906 Act. Really all we're talking about at that point is the purity. Now in 1938 we start to see an increased role for the FDA. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act now required pre-market testing for toxicity. So if you had pure cocaine in your toothache drops, you were okay under the 1906 law, but then in 1938 you actually had to prove that it was safe to give people that medication as a treatment for a toothache. So this is all we are where we also start to see the labeling with directions that we're accustomed to. It was not always available in the same form that we're used to now, but that was when we started requiring that here in the United States. Different directions for OTC, over-the-counter drugs, and prescription drugs. If the drug is going to be sold over the counter, if it's approved for that, then it needs consumer instructions. And then, of course, if it's a prescription drug, then it is required to be sold only with a prescription from a healthcare professional. All right, so another major category of concern with these laws is the effectiveness. Does the medication actually do what you're saying it does? So we didn't see any concern about that in the 1906 law, and then in 1938 we also did not see changes that applied to effectiveness. We don't actually see laws applying to effectiveness until 1962. So there we see the Kefauver-Harris amendments to the Act, and now we're requiring a couple of different things. First of all, before you can start testing your drug with human subjects, you need to get pre-approval. You need to get approval from the FDA that you can actually start your human testing. And if you're going to be advertising, because we're starting to see that increasing power of advertising, this is the Mad Men era for those of you who are fans, you have to include information about adverse reactions. So we're very familiar with that, but this actually didn't come about until 1962. And if it's a new drug, so not existing drugs, but for new drugs, you actually have to demonstrate that it does what you say it does. You have to demonstrate that it's effective for the illnesses that you mentioned. So this whole idea that we're going to sell drugs that only contain what we say they do, that are safe for human consumption and do what we say they're going to do, is as recent as 1962 here in the United States. So we talked a bit about the FDA and that new drug approval process, and it's important to know this is a very complicated and expensive process. So when we talk about things like orphan diseases, diseases that are not very prevalent in our society, or things that might be very expensive, like the development of a new antibiotic or a new vaccine, that we're looking at an expensive and complicated process when we're trying to get one of these approved. So while the drug is being researched, so while it's preclinical, so it's before it's in use, the company that's developing it has to submit an IND, a Notice of Claimed Investigational Exemption for a new drug. So at some point they're going to start giving it to people without FDA approval. So this is the notice that they're interested in starting to investigate this drug. And then they'll move into the clinical trials phase. At the end of it, they'll get full FDA approval, but that IND has to be approved before they can move into the clinical trials that lead to final approval. So a phase 1 trial, this is actually where the medication is tested on healthy volunteers. So these are not people who have the condition that the drug is targeted to. And the question here is how the drug is absorbed and excreted. So it'll be administered to about 20 to 80 people. And we're looking for evidence that the drug does not cause additional health problems in those volunteers, and that it is absorbed and excreted in the way that the researchers expected. So at phase 2, now we start talking about effectiveness. So phase 1 is safety, phase 2 is effectiveness. Purity, we're assuming, based on the 1906 law, is already handled. So phase 2, we're talking about effectiveness. Now we start testing with a few hundred patients who actually have the condition of concern, and those patients are closely monitored for any possible side effects. And also the drug needs to be established that it's more effective than the current approved option. And then finally, in phase 3, we start to see broader effectiveness testing. So we're looking at now thousands of patients, typically 1,000 to 5,000, continuing to ask those questions about additional side effects and whether or not the drug is more effective than the current option. So we have some additional legislation that affects the FDA. We just talked a bit about the Orphan Drug Act. So these are drugs for diseases that are rare. So there's probably not a lot of financial incentive for a drug company to invest all that money in the research and development and then the clinical trial and approval process for a drug that they may only sell a handful of prescriptions for every year. So the Orphan Drug Act offered financial incentives in terms of tax breaks and other incentives to companies that would be willing to take on that type of research, development, and testing. We also had the Prescription Drug Marketing Act of 1988. So before this act was passed, the efforts of drug companies to market their new products to physicians really came into question. So before we leave the FDA, we've got a couple of other important pieces of legislation that affect the FDA and how it operates. The first one applies to those orphan diseases, the ones that we just talked about that only affect a handful of people here in the United States and around the world. So the Orphan Drug Act gives drug companies some financial incentives for developing drugs for those rare disorders. So we've got an expensive R&D process, and then we've got an expensive 3-stage clinical trial process, and it may not make financial sense for a company to pursue a drug that they may only write a few prescriptions for a year. So this act makes it more financially feasible for pharmaceutical companies to pursue medications for those more rare diseases. We've also got the Prescription Drug Marketing Act of 1988. Before this act passed, there was really not a lot of regulation in place on how prescription drugs could be marketed to physicians. Now, we had some restrictions on marketing to consumers, but to physicians, there weren't a lot of rules in place, and there were some abuses that made people wonder whether physicians were prescribing the medications because they were the best choice or because of some of the incentives offered by the pharmaceutical companies. So in 1988, we passed that law, and now the interactions that can take place between physicians and pharmaceutical companies are much more closely managed. And the goal there, of course, is patient safety, making sure that patients receive the drug that's best for them, for health, safety, and financial reasons, as opposed to the drug that's best for the physician based on marketing reasons. And then finally, 1997, the FDA Modernization Act. So this updated the act, which again, this is fairly old. So some new guidelines for adverse effects. What happened when a drug had already been approved, hit the market, and then we started seeing more adverse effects than we'd like to see. And then off-label use. So off-label use is interesting. An off-label use of a drug is one that is not approved by the FDA. So when the drug goes through that approval process with the FDA, the manufacturer, the pharmaceutical company, has to be very clear about what the purpose of the drug is and how effective the drug is in treating that condition. Now, drugs, of course, are complicated substances, and sometimes they have effects that are not anticipated. If we think about maybe Zyban, which was originally marketed as an assist for tobacco cessation, so a way to help people quit smoking, and people found that it also worked as an antidepressant. So if the drug was not approved as an antidepressant, then an off-label use would be using that medication, trade name Zyban, to treat depression. Now, in this case, they went back through the approval process, and they also had the medication, I believe it's bupropion, approved for antidepressant use as well. Okay, so that's an off-label use. And before that 1997 Modernization Act, drug companies were allowed to distribute that off-label use, or at least it wasn't, their behavior wasn't restricted. So after 1997, if it has not gone through the FDA approval process for that specific condition, then the pharmaceutical company can't distribute any information for that use, only the one that it was approved for. Now, an important category of drugs that we cover here in class, and people in this class usually find this information surprising, is about dietary supplements. So if you look at the examples there in that photo, when we walk into our local, maybe our Target or our nutrition store here in Las Vegas, and we pull one of these products off the shelves, they look like over-the-counter medications, and we tend to assume that they are regulated in the same way as our over-the-counter and pharmaceutical and prescription-based pharmaceuticals. The reality is that this is not true. Dietary supplements are not subject to the same regulations as the other products that are monitored by the FDA. We do have a couple of basic restrictions in place. Back to purity, the label has to be honest about what's inside the package. So if they're going to say that it contains St. John's wort, then that's what needs to be in it. And they can't make unsubstantiated direct claims, like say St. John's wort. We can't claim that it treats depression. But if you look at the label on that package, what it says is that it provides support for positive mood balance. So that's different than saying that it treats depression. Okay, so that's a direct claim and an indirect claim. It can make that general claim that it's good for your mood. And then very important, especially if you consume a lot of supplements, is that you should realize that there's no safety testing for these products. Okay, so we talked about purity, effectiveness, and safety. The purity, we've got the effectiveness, there's really no control over. And then safety, there's no clinical trial process for these substances. So a manufacturer can create a supplement, put it out there on the market. It can contain exactly what it says it does, and it can still be dangerous for your health. And that's why we see these they tend to be very well publicized recalls of supplement products. It goes out into the market, people take it, we see serious illness, sometimes we even see death, and then we see the product recalled off the market. So we're putting the product out there in the market first, and then we're playing catch up. So very important to realize if you're consuming supplements that they are not regulated and monitored by the FDA, and there's no clinical trial process in place to ensure your safety. So definitely something to be aware of if this is something that's a part of your life. Okay, so we talked about our legislative efforts to control legal drugs, so our pharmaceuticals. Now we're switching gears and we're talking more about those drugs that we've decided are illicit. So here we're going to start calling those controlled substances. So our very first federal effort here, 1914 Harrison Act, again, we did see in local communities some earlier efforts, but the first time we saw federal legislation, the Harrison Act. And again, its purpose here is to start getting a piece of the action. It's going to be the federal government taxing this. But the enforcement arm at the time, the narcotics division, the way that they interpreted it, it actually led down the road to criminalization of drug use at a federal level. We started seeing physicians and pharmacists arrested for behavior that should have been taxable under the law. And what we really see here is a change of social norms that kind of culminates in the 18th Amendment, which kicked off prohibition. We see the legal consequences for dealing in illicit drugs become more and more serious throughout the 20th century. In 1922, we see the penalties double for dealing in illegal drugs. And another really interesting change that occurred over the 20th century is this dichotomy between prison versus rehabilitation for drug users. So in the 19th century in the United States, if you started taking those cocaine tooth drops, there was a strong possibility that you would become dependent on that substance. But in the 19th century, even here in the United States, we tended to view your dependence as something, as a medical condition. People were sympathetic. They offered you treatment options. There were places where you could go, like we consider now our rehab program, to help you get over that dependence. We didn't see it as a behavior that deserved punishment. And we still see this in place in the early 20th century, although of course we'll see that change over the course of that time period as well. Okay, so some more history of legislation about our drugs that we consider illicit here in the U.S. In 1930, we see the Treasury Department form a Bureau of Narcotics. So we see this role for enforcement at the federal level becoming more and more important. We've got our first ever drug czar, Harry Anslinger at the time, and he had a particular distaste for the use of marijuana. We'll talk more about that when we discuss marijuana later in the semester. But marijuana, same as the opium and cocaine efforts, our very first effort to control that was, again, through taxes. We're going to get some money out of it before we actually make it illegal. So that was in 1937. We see some updates on the penalties for drug use and manufacture and sale here in the United States in 1956. And then in 1965, we see new classes added to our list of controlled substances. So we see first effort is to collect some money from it. We're going to tax it. And then we see some minor penalties. We see the penalties become more serious. And then we see more drugs being added to this list. So really the trend throughout the 20th century, more drugs added to the category of controlled substances or illicit drugs, and more and tougher penalties for people who manufacture, sell, and use them. 1970, so getting close to the end of the 20th century, we see a major update to those laws, the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. So here we see all of the previous laws are replaced or updated by this piece of legislation. And we do start to see some conflicts between state and federal laws, basically either mostly on the severity of the penalties. So with this act, the federal government says that anything that is controlled by the act is now under federal jurisdiction. And here in the 21st century, as we're starting to see the cultural shift in perspectives on marijuana use, we're continuing to see that conflict between state and federal laws. We also see increased funding now, finally, for prevention and treatment. But at the same time, we do see increased funding for enforcement. So we're no longer trying to tax those drugs as of 1970. If we consider it a drug that's covered by the act, then it is illegal to be used. So they're all illicit, and we're no longer trying to use taxation as a tool. And an interesting trend that we see now is we see that separation from the scientific or medical perspective on dependence. We see that separated from the process of enforcement, and we continue to see the consequences of that when we talk about the prison population here in the United States. So when we talk about controlled substances, if you've ever heard the term Schedule 1, Schedule 3, Schedule 5, this is how that actually looks. So the schedules are categories for basically the level of danger for the drug. Schedule 1, the criteria here is that there's high potential for abuse. So folks who start using the drug are likely to become dependent. and no accepted medical use. So there's no real medical reason to use the drug, and then that there's a lack of accepted safety. Schedule 2, we still see that high potential for abuse, but we do have a currently accepted medical use. So just say maybe the contrast here between heroin and morphine. In the United States, you can still get a prescription for morphine. We see this sometimes used for pain management during end of life, but you're not going to get a prescription for heroin anywhere in the U.S. Ecstasy is also on this list, so you're not really going to get a prescription for a Schedule 1 drug. But of course, our second example there, marijuana, is going to be an interesting case here, right? Because we do know that we see the cultural landscape on marijuana use really changing in the United States at this time. So we'll talk a little bit more later in the semester about how marijuana ended up on the in the Schedule 1 category. As we move down through the list, we're going to see less potential for abuse and less concern about potential dependence as we move down through. So when we talk about a Schedule 5 drug, now we're talking about maybe a cough syrup with codeine, which many of us have taken throughout our lives. There is some potential for abuse, but it's fairly low. There's definitely a currently accepted medical use, but of all the scheduled drugs, we're least worried about the potential for abuse in that particular category. So that's the schedules and some examples of how of which substances fit in which category. Okay, so we had our big comprehensive reform and update act, Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act in 1970, and then in 1986 we see some updates. We see some amendments that really increased the penalties for possession and sale of schedules of drugs on the controlled substances schedules. And we also see a really interesting change in the way that we handle sentencing for various forms of cocaine. We'll talk more about that during our cocaine unit. And then in 1998, we start to see some changes in that don't apply to the actual drugs themselves, but to what we call the precursors. And if you look at the item that the gentleman in the picture of the right was holding before 1998, you were definitely able to purchase that. Now it's considered paraphernalia, and possession of drug paraphernalia can also be illegal. And what is paraphernalia and what is not is established by our new Office of National Drug Control Policy. Okay, so we talked a little bit about prison population and the conflict between state and local regulations. This between state and federal regulations, but we also have conflicts between state and local legislations because many of the penalties for drug manufacturing, sale, use, and possession are actually mandated at the state level. We see a lot of variety from state to state. Now, if there is a federal law in place for that particular substance, then that federal law is going to override whatever the state law is. And if you look at the chart at the bottom of the slide, we're looking at the number of prisoners per 1,000 population here in the United States. You see that really dramatic jump between 1985, starting in 1985 and continuing throughout the rest of the chart. It's where we see this societal trend we call the war on drugs beginning. So we start to see a much higher incarceration rate, and a lot of this has to do with changes in the way that we handled sentencing for drug convictions. There's lots of different opinions on the appropriateness and effectiveness of these changes, but the consequences they're just inescapable. At the end of this, we've ended up with the greatest proportion of our citizens in prison compared to any other country in the world. So we talked about federal legislation for legal drugs, federal legislation for illegal drugs, and then we're just going to talk quickly about federal requirements for drug screening. So this is when we test people for drugs. There are populations here in the United States that are subject to mandatory drug testing. These include military and federal employees. We may have some regulations in place at private companies. This can be important to be aware of if you are talking about those conflicts between state and federal law. If you are in a state where medical or recreational use of marijuana is legal, you may still work for an employer that considers a positive marijuana test grounds for dismissal, and because of the state of the federal law, that's definitely a viable option for them. So we're in an interesting state, especially with that particular drug, when we talk about what happens after those drug testing results. Of course, if it's a private company, they can make their own rules. Military and federal employees are subject to federal rules. So when we talk about drug testing, we've got lots of different issues, and they're the same ones that we face anytime that we do a test. We've got different ways to test for the same substance, and those tests may yield different results. And we've also got different levels of sensitivity for different tests. Let's say that the subject of the test smoked marijuana 30 days ago. There may be different tests that have differing abilities to detect whether or not that use occurred. So when we talk about testing, it tends to be, we tend to look at positives and negatives as conclusive information, but it's important to know that the results may vary based on the testing, the time frame, and the sensitivity of the test. All right, so we looked at one of the impacts of drug enforcement when we looked at the increased incarceration rate here in the United States through the end of the 20th century. But it's important also to consider the amount of money that goes into drug enforcement. In 1980, we were already spending $1 billion on drug enforcement. In 2013, we were up to over $25 billion, so that's billion with a B, a very substantial proportion of our federal budget. And it's not just here in the United States. The DEA goes abroad to over 40 countries. And we talked about that conflict between federal and state legislation, but we also may have conflicts between different kinds of national legislation. Amsterdam has a reputation, of course, for its lack of regulation on drug use, and we're continuing to see changes there as well. Uruguay, for example, recently legalized marijuana. The United Nations continues to take the approach that these efforts towards legalization are an area of concern, but it's definitely going to be something interesting to keep an eye on. And of course, it's not just the DEA that's affected by affected by or contributes to the cost of drug enforcement. We also see other federal agencies such as the FAA and even the National Park Service that become involved in these enforcement activities. So $25 billion is a very high price tag, but it's not the only cost of our current approach to drug enforcement here in the United States. Just in terms of dollars, that increased prison population needs to be housed, maintained, and cared for, so there's definitely a cost that goes with that as well. We've got that loss of individual freedom as a social cost. It does cause conflict in our international policy with other countries sometimes. And then we also see the commission of crimes for individuals who are interested in purchasing drugs and looking to acquire funds to do that. So all these costs, the extremely high financial price tag, the other social costs, even the international relations costs, have been almost entirely ineffective. We have not been able to eliminate drug use here in the United States with the approach that we've been pursuing with its roots in the 20th century. So in terms of what we are able to do when we talk about the drug enforcement process here in the United States, how effective we actually are. It's difficult to say for sure. Obviously, if the drugs are being manufactured or imported illegally, they don't report the quantity that they're manufacturing or importing to the federal government so that we can figure out how much we're intercepting. But folks who specialize in this suggest that we are currently seizing approximately 10 to 15% of the illegal drug supply in the United States. There are some basic market consequences for this behavior. When we make the drug illicit, we restrict the supply. If the demand doesn't go anywhere, then the price goes up. And we increase the amount of money and thus the amount of power involved in the transaction, even though it remains illegal. So definitely some consequences to consider there. And if you hear people discuss legalization, that's one of the goals of that effort, is to reduce the amount of money and power involved in the transactions by making by removing the restrictions on the legality of the substance. And then another thing to consider is whether those drug laws actually keep people from becoming users. And it's one that we don't really know the answer to. We don't really know whether people who don't become dependent, don't use, were never going to in the first place, or whether the presence of those laws has made a difference. So lots of interesting questions that we'll continue to discuss throughout the semester. Please reach out if you have any questions, and I will talk to you next time.